Every town keeps one man it has decided to laugh at, and that year Hensley Gap had chosen Elias Ward. They called him crazy for it, and maybe, if you had climbed the wagon road in those first raw months and watched him out on the ridge in the wind, you would have called him crazy too. Because Elias had buried his wife Ruth in the churchyard that fall, and instead of grieving the way grief is supposed to look, he had gone up alone to the old cabin on Cutter's Ridge and begun to plant trees, hundreds of them, pine and spruce and oak, a slow green ring around a house nobody came to visit. The frost was already silvering the mornings. He planted anyway. If you have ever held on to something the whole world told you to let go of, then settle in and stay with me a while, and subscribe to Front Porch Tales and ring the bell, because this is a story for you. To understand the laughing, you have to understand the losing first. Ruth Ward had gone slow, all through a hot, dry summer. A fever that came and left and came again until it did not leave, and Elias had sat by the bed and watched a strong woman grow light as a bird in his hands. They had wanted children, and the Lord had not sent any, and so at the end there was only the two of them and a house full of quiet, and then only the one of them. He carried her down the ridge himself. He would not let the men from the Gap carry her. That was the first thing the town held against him, though nobody said so out loud. The second was the trees. A grown man with good bottomland he could have sold, spending the last of his money and every daylight hour on seedlings, digging holes in ground that was already turning hard, planting a wall of timber around a cabin at the top of a wind-scoured ridge where nothing worth having had ever grown. It made no sense to them, and a thing that makes no sense frightens people, and frightened people laugh so they will not have to feel the other thing. Cyrus Hale did more than laugh. Cyrus owned the flat green heart of the valley, the mill and the store's mortgage, and a fine white house with a porch that ran the whole front of it, and Cyrus had wanted the Ward Ridge for years. Not for what grew on it, but for the sheltered draw on its north side that he could not quite explain his hunger for. One cold Sunday morning, while the whole congregation stood in the churchyard below in their good coats, 3 of Cyrus's hired men rode the ridge road and pulled up a full row of Elias's new saplings, 40 little trees, and threw them down into the creek, laughing the whole time, and the people in the churchyard looked up and saw it, and did not one of them start up the hill. Old Nettie Cole saw. A boy named Sam saw. Nobody else moved. That week at the store, with a dozen men listening, Cyrus made his offer plain. "A grieving man has no business holding good land," he said, counting coins onto the counter that would not have bought a mule. "Sell me the ridge cheap, Ward, before the first hard frost makes firewood of your foolishness." Elias took his flour and his nails and his little sack of seed. "It's not for sale," he said, and that was all. And he walked the 4 miles back up the wagon road in the cold and pulled 40 drowned saplings out of the creek and planted them again in the dark by lantern light, because a promise does not care whether anyone is watching it be kept. The ridge in those days was a hard, honest place, all hoarfrost and wind and the smell of cut cedar, the split rail fence gone gray, the chinking fallen out from between the cabin logs so the north wind found its way to the wood stove and made the flame lean. Elias worked it the way a man works a grave he has decided to turn into a garden. He cleared the thicket. He hauled water up from the spring in the sheltered draw, 2 buckets at a time, and gave each seedling its cup. He talked to nobody, because there was nobody, and the silence up there was so deep that when a wagon finally did climb the road, he heard it a full mile off. It was Nettie Cole's wagon, and Nettie Cole was 80 if she was a day, a small, fierce widow whose late husband had run the only seedling nursery the Gap ever had. She did not climb down to comfort him. She climbed down to unload. In the wagon bed were 200 young trees, root-balled in wet burlap, the last of her husband's stock that she had been keeping in the root cellar. "Frank grew these," she said. "I'm too old to plant them and too stubborn to burn them. You'll take them or you'll insult me." He took them. She stayed for coffee off the wood stove, and she did not laugh once. She looked out the door at the young ring already circling the cabin, and she said a strange thing. "My grandmother lived through the big snow, the one they don't hardly remember now. The winter the drifts came up over the second-story windows down in the valley. Whole families froze in their own front rooms. But not the ones behind the old timber. The homesteads with a windbreak, they came through. The wind broke on the trees and slid over the top of them, and the houses underneath stayed livable." She set down her cup. "Somebody taught you that, Elias Ward, or something did. What the Gap did not know yet, and what Elias himself did not fully know, was that the trees were not his idea at all, and that the answer to the whole strange business was folded up and waiting for him not 100 feet from where he slept. That night, after Nettie's wagon had rattled back down into the dark, he sat by the wood stove with his hands open on his knees and looked up at the mantel, where a small cedar box had sat, unopened since the day he carried Ruth up the hill. He could not make himself reach for it. Not yet. He banked the fire and lay down and listened to the wind test the walls, and for the first time in a long while he was too tired to feel entirely alone. Morning on the ridge came the way it always came, gray and honest, and Elias built up the fire and set the pot on and stood in the door with his coffee while the sun cleared the far mountains. Then he walked the rows. This became the shape of his days, the one ritual he never broke. Coffee, then the rows, from the first light until his hands would not close. He watered when the ground allowed it, and mulched with leaf mold when it did not. And he learned each tree the way a man learns faces. The first one he had ever put in the ground, the very first, a single white pine set exactly where Ruth used to stand of an evening to watch the light go. He never passed without laying his hand on it. He called it Ruth's pine, only ever to himself, and by that first winter it already stood taller than he did, and its needles held the frost like something out of Scripture. He was on the rows the morning the wagon came that changed the quiet for good. A young woman drove it, badly, a thin, worn woman with a black dress gone rusty at the seams and 2 children wedged on the seat beside her. A boy of maybe 10 and a little girl not more than 5. Her name was Hannah, she said, and her husband had died on the river the spring before, and she had come up from downstate following the promise of millwork that had turned out to be nothing, and now she had no place. And somebody at the store, an old woman, had told her there was a man on the ridge who might have need of hands and would not ask questions. "I can't pay much," Elias said. He looked at the boy. "Can he plant a straight line?" "He can learn," Hannah said. "That's the same thing," said Elias, "if you've got the winter to learn it in." He gave them the lean-to off the north wall, and then, when he saw how the wind found it, he gave them the cabin's back room and took the lean-to himself, and he would not hear another word about it. The boy Sam turned out to have a gift for it, a careful hand and a patience past his years, and by the second week he was setting seedlings with a snap of the wrist Elias envied. The little girl, Pearl, took to following Elias down the rows and asking the name of every single tree, and Elias, who had named none of them out loud, began to make up names to give her, and was surprised to find it did not hurt the way he expected. Nettie came up twice more with what the valley could spare, a crock of butter, a sack of dried apples, a bolt of wool. Word of that got down the mountain, and word came back up the way it does, thin and cold. Cyrus Hale was telling folks the ridge would be his by spring, that the bank held paper on it, that a widower with a woman and 2 strange children camping in his cabin was proof the man had come unhinged and ought to be seen to. None of it was true, and all of it traveled, and Elias heard it the way you hear weather coming, and said nothing, and planted. There was one evening, though, when it caught him. He had found, tangled in the roots of a seedling that had not made it, a scrap of the burlap Nettie's husband had used, and something about the smell of it, wet and green and full of a dead man's care, took his legs out from under him. He knelt at the foot of Ruth's pine in the last light with his forehead against the bark, and he shook, once, hard, the way the ridge itself seemed to shake in a big wind. And then it passed, and he stood up, and he wiped his face on his sleeve, and he went in to supper. Pearl asked him why his eyes were red, and he said the cold did that to a man's eyes. And the boy Sam looked at him and did not say anything at all, which was its own kind of knowing. They ate together after that, the 4 of them, every night, the wood stove ticking and the wind walking the ridge outside. And against all the arithmetic of his grief, Elias began to trust the place he had made, and the people the winter had blown into it. But the cedar box on the mantel still held something Elias had not been able to bring himself to open since the day he carried Ruth up the hill. And one gray afternoon he was going to read something folded inside it that had been waiting years for him to be ready. It was Pearl who did it. She had climbed on a chair after a spool of thread and knocked the box down, and it fell open on the floorboards, and out slid a folded paper gone soft as cloth, and beneath it a stiffer thing, old and creased, a map. Pearl looked up at him, frightened she had broken something. "It's all right," Elias said, though his heart was going like a hammer. He sent the children to the spring for water. Then he sat down by the window and unfolded his wife's last letter. It was in Ruth's hand, dated the summer she took sick, when she had still been able to hold a pen. She had written it, she said, because she knew where the fever was going and he did not, and there were things a woman could not say out loud to a man she loved without them both breaking. And then she told him about her grandmother, and the big snow, and the windbreak that had stood between a whole family and the killing wind. The same story Nettie had told without knowing she was telling it back to him. "My grandmother made me promise," Ruth had written, "and now I am making you promise, because I will not be here to do it, and because I know you, Elias, and I know that if you have a thing to build you will not lie down and die of missing me. Plant them thick. Plant them all the way around. Plant them for the winter neither of us will see." He read it 3 times. Then he unfolded the map. It was old, far older than the letter, drawn in a careful surveyor's hand, and across the top in faded ink was written the name of his grandfather, Amos Ward, and a year from long before Elias was born. It showed the ridge, and the cabin, and a ring, a planted ring of timber exactly where Elias had been putting his trees, marked shelter belt in the old man's script. It showed the sheltered draw on the north side, and there, drawn plain, was the spring. The only sure spring on that whole shoulder of the mountain. The one Cyrus Hale had wanted for years, without ever letting on why. And along the bottom, in a county clerk's stamp gone brown with age, was the record that made the ridge worth 10 of Cyrus's flat green acres, if a man knew how to read it. His grandfather had not planted timber to be sold. He had planted a wall against a winter he knew would come again, and he had left the proof of it in a cedar box for whichever of his blood turned out to have the sense to open it. Elias sat a long time in the failing light. Then he saddled up and rode down to Nettie Cole, and he laid the letter and the map on her kitchen table, and the old woman put on her spectacles and read, and her hand came up to her mouth. "That's Amos's hand," she said. "I'd know it anywhere. And that's the truth about the big snow, every word." She looked at him over the tops of her glasses, and her eyes were bright and hard. He wasn't burying his wife up there, Elias. He was keeping a promise to her. You go on and let this town keep laughing. It won't laugh long. Word of a thing has a way of running downhill faster than a man on a horse. Before that week was out, it had reached Cyrus Hale that the crazy man on the ridge had papers, that there was a spring up there and old survey work that named it, that the worthless draw he had been trying to buy for the price of a mule might be the most valuable ground in the county. And Cyrus, who had offered pennies for it in front of a dozen witnesses, understood all at once how that was going to look, and set his jaw, and began to make quiet arrangements to have the ridge declared and taken before a grieving fool could learn what he was sitting on. The winter that settled the whole business came early, and it came the way the old people had always said it would, all at once and without mercy. It began as a fine dry snow on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday night the wind out of the north had risen to a scream nobody living had heard before, and it came down off the mountains and hit the flat open valley like the flat of a hand. Down in the gap the snow did not fall so much as fly, sideways, packing against every north wall, filling the lanes, tearing the tin off Cyrus Hale's fine long porch, and sending it end over end into the dark. The valley had no windbreak. The valley had cut its timber for pasture 2 generations back. There was nothing between Hensley Gap and the wind but the memory of trees. But the ridge held. Behind Elias's ring, behind Amos Ward's shelter belt and Frank Cole's last 200 seedlings and 40 little trees pulled twice out of a creek, the wind broke and rose and slid up and over, the way Nettie's grandmother had known it would. And in the still pocket underneath, the cabin stood warm with its stove ticking and its lamps lit. And up the ridge road in the black and howling night came the valley, on foot, leading children and old people, because the word had gone out that the only place the wind could not reach was the top of Cutter's Ridge, behind the crazy man's trees. Hannah's own kin came, and the storekeeper and his family, and old folks half carried through the drifts, and near the end, stumbling, snow to his waist, came Cyrus Hale, with his wife and his children, his fine house behind him already going dark and cold. He stood in the doorway of the cabin he had tried to steal, ice in his beard, and he could not make himself speak. Behind him the whole sheltering crowd went quiet, because they all knew, every soul in the gap knew by then, what this man had done and tried to do. It was the storekeeper who said it, loud, so the room would hear. You offered him coins for this ridge, Cyrus, in front of all of us. Called it firewood. And these trees are the only reason your children are going to see morning. Nobody answered him. Cyrus stood in the doorway with the wind screaming at his back and the warmth in front of him, and nowhere on God's earth left to hide his face. Elias crossed the room. He did not raise his voice. He never had. I didn't plant them to prove anybody wrong, he said, and the whole crowd leaned in to hear him over the storm. I planted them because I made a promise to my wife. Now get your family in by the fire, Cyrus. The wind doesn't care whose land it is. And Cyrus Hale, the richest man in the valley, came in out of the cold and sat down among the people he had lorded over, and warmed his children at another man's stove, and did not say one word, and everyone saw it, and that was the whole of his defeat. He was never struck. He was never jailed. He simply lost. In one night, in front of everyone who mattered to him, the one thing he had spent his life buying, which was the right to be looked up to. In the spring he sold the mill and moved his family down the river, and it was said he never came back up the mountain again. They had laughed at a wall built against a wind that had not yet come. But the wind always comes. When the spring finally worked its way back up to the gap and the last gray drifts sank into the ground, The ridge was a changed place, and so was the valley's idea of it. The ring stood green and thickening, and men who had thrown its saplings in a creek now drove their own children up the wagon road on a Sunday to walk between the rows and marvel. And more than one went home and put seedlings of his own in the ground along his north fence. Hannah and the children had stayed. There was never any question of them leaving. And if what grew between the widow and the widower was slow and mostly unspoken, it was real. And it was enough. And it looked less like a courtship than like a family the winter had simply handed to two people who had each lost one. The boy Sam ran the planting now. Little Pearl had a name for every tree, and this time Elias let her write them down. Ruth's pine stood tallest of them all, up where she used to watch the light, and Elias had built a plain bench beneath it. And it was there of an evening that Nettie Cole found him, wrapped against the cool-in-the-wool quilt Ruth had made, watching the valley go gold below. "You could have told them," Nettie said, easing down beside him. "About the papers, about the spring. Might have saved yourself a hard year of being laughed at." "They'd not have believed the papers," Elias said. "They believed the trees in the end, because the trees were true whether they believed them or not." He was quiet a moment. Ruth knew that. She knew a promise doesn't need a witness to be worth keeping. Sometimes the thing a whole town calls madness is only love keeping a longer calendar than the rest of us, planting for a season it will never live to sit in, building a wall against a wind that has not yet come, keeping faith with the dead and the not yet born when the living have all turned away to laugh. Sometimes the fool on the hill is the only one who remembered what the mountain was going to do. And sometimes God's slowest mercies are the ones that grow, ring by ring and year by year, until the day the whole valley climbs the hill to shelter in them. Have you ever held on to something the whole world told you to let go of, and lived long enough to see it be the very thing that saved you? If this story warmed something in you tonight, stay a while with us. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Subscribe to Front Porch Tales and ring the bell so the next story finds you. And share this one with somebody who's holding on to a promise nobody else understands. Thank you for climbing this ridge with me. There's another story waiting for you already, and a warm fire besides. And to this day, when the north wind comes down hard off the mountains, the folks in Hensley Gap look up at that dark crown of timber on Cutter's Ridge, and they do not laugh anymore. They give thanks, and they tell their children about the man they once called crazy.